The morning fog rolled across the naval base as Captain Marcus Rodriguez stepped out of his office, adjusting his crisp uniform. 23 years of service had taught him to spot irregularities from a mile away, and today something caught his eye immediately. Standing near the commissary entrance was a woman in her 70s, wearing what appeared to be a faded military jacket that looked like it had survived several wars. Rodriguez chuckled to himself as he approached the woman. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite her age, she carried herself with remarkable posture. The jacket, however, was a different story entirely. The fabric was worn thin in places. The color had faded from what might once have been olive green to something resembling muddy brown, and there were patches sewn on with thread that didn't quite match. "Ma'am, that jacket's older than dirt," Rodriguez said with a friendly laugh as he drew closer. He meant no disrespect. It was simply his way of breaking the ice with civilians who visited the base. The woman turned to face him, and he noticed her eyes held an intensity that seemed oddly familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. The woman smiled politely, but said nothing about the jacket comment. Instead, she extended a weathered hand. "Captain Rodriguez, I presume? I'm Eleanor Hartwell. I have an appointment with you this morning." Her voice carried a slight rasp that spoke of years and experience, but there was something else there too, an authority that made Rodriguez unconsciously straighten his posture. As they walked toward his office, Rodriguez found himself stealing glances at the mysterious jacket. Up close, he could see that what he had initially dismissed as random patches were actually carefully placed elements. Some appeared to be covering areas where insignia might have once been attached. Others looked like they were hiding damage, perhaps burns or tears that told stories he couldn't begin to imagine. "I hope you don't mind me saying, Mrs. Hartwell, but that jacket has certainly seen better days," Rodriguez commented as he held open the door to the administrative building. "Looks like it might be a family heirloom or something from a military surplus store." Eleanor paused at the threshold, her hand briefly touching one of the faded patches on the jacket's chest. "Something like that, Captain," she replied quietly, "though I think you might be surprised by its actual history." The corridors of the administrative building echoed with their footsteps as Rodriguez led her toward his office. Other personnel they passed gave respectful nods to the captain, but he noticed several double takes when they saw Eleanor's jacket. Some of the older non-commissioned officers seemed to linger, their eyes following the pair with expressions Rodriguez couldn't quite interpret. "Coffee, Mrs. Hartwell," Rodriguez offered as they entered his office. The space was typical military efficiency: clean desk, filing cabinets, American flag in the corner, and walls decorated with commendations and photographs from various deployments and ceremonies. "That would be lovely, thank you." Eleanor settled into the chair across from his desk, but she didn't remove the jacket despite the warmth of the office. Rodriguez noticed she kept her hands resting on the armrests, but her fingers occasionally moved to touch different parts of the jacket's fabric, almost as if she were reading Braille. As Rodriguez prepared the coffee, he tried to recall why he had agreed to this meeting. His assistant had scheduled it, mentioning something about a historical research project related to military personnel records. It wasn't unusual for family members to seek information about relatives who had served, especially older relatives trying to piece together family military history. "So, Mrs. Hartwell," Rodriguez began, settling behind his desk with 2 steaming mugs, "my assistant mentioned you're researching military records? Looking into a family member's service, perhaps?" Eleanor accepted the coffee with both hands, and Rodriguez noticed several small scars across her knuckles and fingers, the kind that suggested someone who had worked with their hands, possibly in demanding or dangerous conditions. "In a manner of speaking, yes," she replied, "though the records I'm interested in might be somewhat complicated to access." "Complicated how?" Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, his curiosity growing. Most requests for military records were straightforward, if sometimes bureaucratically challenging. "Well, Captain, some of the service I'm researching was conducted under circumstances that required a certain level of discretion." Eleanor's eyes met his directly, and Rodriguez felt that familiar sensation again, the feeling that he should recognize something about this woman. Classified operations? Rodriguez set down his coffee mug, his demeanor shifting slightly toward the more formal. If this involved classified materials, there would be protocols to follow and clearances to verify. Eleanor nodded slowly. Among other things, yes. Operations that, officially, never happened. Personnel who, according to most records, were never there. She paused, taking a sip of her coffee. I'm hoping you might help me understand what procedures exist for acknowledging service that was deliberately obscured. Rodriguez felt the first stirring of something beyond mere curiosity. During his years in the Navy, he had heard whispers of operations and personnel whose existence was compartmentalized to such a degree that even knowing about them required special clearance. He had always assumed such things were the stuff of movies and novels, but the way Eleanor spoke suggested otherwise. Mrs. Hartwell, I have to ask, what's your connection to this research? Are you representing a family member or working with a historical organization? Rodriguez kept his voice professional, but he was beginning to sense that this conversation might venture into territory he wasn't prepared for. Eleanor set down her coffee and looked directly at him. Her weathered hands moved to the front of the jacket, and Rodriguez watched as she began to carefully work at what he had assumed was just another patch. As her fingers manipulated the fabric, he realized it wasn't actually a patch at all. It was a cleverly concealed flap that had been sewn to blend seamlessly with the jacket's worn appearance. Captain Rodriguez, Eleanor said quietly, her voice taking on a tone that made him unconsciously lean forward. Before I answer that question, I think you should see what this old jacket has been hiding all these years. Captain Rodriguez watched in fascination as Eleanor's fingers worked with practiced precision along what he had mistaken for a simple seam. The fabric separated to reveal a hidden inner pocket, and from within it, she withdrew a small, carefully wrapped bundle. The wrapping appeared to be made of the same weathered material as the jacket itself. Captain, what I'm about to show you hasn't seen daylight in over 40 years, Eleanor said, her voice carrying a weight that made Rodriguez realize this meeting was about to become something far more significant than a routine records request. She unwrapped the bundle with the kind of reverence typically reserved for handling explosive devices or ancient artifacts. Inside was a collection of items that made Rodriguez's breath catch in his throat. There were patches, insignia, and what appeared to be identification materials, but unlike anything he had ever seen in his military career. The patches were black with silver threading, featuring symbols and unit designations that Rodriguez didn't recognize despite his extensive knowledge of military heraldry. One patch in particular drew his attention. It showed a stylized globe with wings, surrounded by text too small for him to read from across the desk. Mrs. Hartwell, Rodriguez said carefully, I think I need to understand exactly who you are before we go any further. Eleanor nodded, as if she had been expecting this moment. Captain, my name is Eleanor Hartwell, but for 12 years of my life, from 1967 to 1979, I was known by a different name and serve in a capacity that officially never existed. She selected one of the items from the bundle, what appeared to be an identification card encased in protective plastic. Rodriguez took the offered item, his hands trembling slightly as he realized what he was looking at. The photograph showed a much younger Eleanor, perhaps in her 30s, with short dark hair and wearing what appeared to be a black uniform. The identification listed her as Agent E. Morrison, with a series of numbers and codes that Rodriguez had never seen before. This is impossible, Rodriguez whispered, though even as he said it, he knew he was looking at something genuine. The materials, the wear patterns, the way the photographs had aged, everything pointed to authenticity. Captain, have you ever heard of the Shadow Division? Eleanor asked quietly. Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine. During his advanced training years ago, he had heard whispers, rumors of a joint military and intelligence unit that operated in complete secrecy during the Cold War. Most officers dismissed such talk as fantasy, the military equivalent of urban legends. I've heard rumors, Rodriguez admitted. But, according to everything I know, no such unit ever officially existed. That's correct, Captain. Officially, we never existed. Unofficially, we were responsible for operations in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and Central America that required what the Pentagon called absolute deniability. Eleanor's voice took on the crisp tone of someone delivering a briefing. We were recruited from all branches of the military, but once we joined the division, our original service records were altered to show administrative transfers or medical discharges. Rodriguez examined the identification more closely. The card bore official seals and markings that appeared legitimate, but from organizations he couldn't identify. Mrs. Hartwell, Agent Morrison, why are you revealing this now? After all these years, Eleanor selected another item from her bundle, a folded document that appeared to be some kind of commendation or citation. Captain, I'm 74 years old. Most of the people who serve with me are dead, and those who aren't are getting close to it. The operations we conducted, the missions we completed, they shaped the course of the Cold War in ways that most people will never know. She unfolded the document, revealing an official commendation signed by individuals whose names Rodriguez recognized from history books, former secretaries of defense, and directors of Central Intelligence. The commendation praised Agent Morrison for extraordinary service in operations of the highest national security importance. But here's the thing, Captain, Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. We were promised that when our service ended, when the division was dissolved, our records would be restored. We were told that our families would eventually know what we had sacrificed, what we had accomplished. Rodriguez looked up from the documents. But that never happened. That never happened, Eleanor confirmed. Instead, we were given new identities, pension arrangements that couldn't be traced back to our real service, and stern warnings about the consequences of discussing our past. Most of us tried to build normal lives, but we carried the weight of secrets that we couldn't share with anyone. The captain set down the identification card and leaned back in his chair. The implications of what Eleanor was telling him were staggering. If the Shadow Division had been real, if there were dozens or perhaps hundreds of veterans whose service had been deliberately erased, it represented one of the most extensive cover-ups in military history. Agent Morrison, Eleanor, what exactly are you asking me to do with this information? Eleanor began carefully rewrapping the items, but she left one patch visible on the desk, the one with the globe and wings. Captain, I'm not the only surviving member of the division. There are 11 of us left, scattered across the country, all carrying similar secrets. We've been in contact with each other for the past several years, sharing information and trying to piece together the full scope of what we accomplished. She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the visible patch. We've decided that it's time for our service to be acknowledged. Not for glory or recognition, but because the families we left behind deserve to know the truth. My daughter thinks her father died in Vietnam and that I spent the war years working as a secretary in Washington. She has no idea that I was conducting intelligence operations behind enemy lines. Rodriguez felt the weight of the moment settling around him. And you want me to help you navigate the process of getting these records declassified? More than that, Captain, Eleanor said, meeting his eyes with the intensity that reminded him suddenly of the most dedicated officers he had served with. We want to make sure that what happened to us, the erasure, the deliberate forgetting, never happens to anyone else. We want to establish protocols for acknowledging classified service when the security concerns have passed. The captain understood now why Eleanor's bearing had seemed so familiar. She carried herself like a veteran because she was one, just not in any way that official records would reflect. The jacket she wore wasn't just a family heirloom or thrift store find. It was her uniform, carefully altered and disguised, but still carrying the symbols of service that had defined a crucial period of her life. Eleanor, Rodriguez said slowly, what you're proposing could have implications that reach all the way to the Pentagon. maybe beyond. I know, Captain, Eleanor replied. That's exactly why we need someone like you. Someone with clearance, with connections, and with the integrity to help us do this the right way. She gestured toward the patch, still visible on his desk. That symbol represents operations that saved American lives and protected national interests in ways that are still classified. We're not asking to reveal operational details or compromise ongoing security. We're just asking to be remembered. Rodriguez looked at the patch again, noting details he had missed before. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far beyond what would be expected for standard military insignia. Everything about Eleanor's story was beginning to make a disturbing kind of sense. What would be the first step? He asked, and Eleanor smiled for the first time since entering his office. Eleanor reached into the hidden pocket of her jacket once more and withdrew a thick manila envelope that had been carefully preserved within a waterproof sleeve. The first step, Captain, is for you to understand the full scope of what the Shadow Division accomplished, and more importantly, what it cost. Rodriguez accepted the envelope with a growing realization that his quiet Tuesday morning had transformed into something that could define the remainder of his military career. The envelope was heavier than he had expected, and when he opened it, he found himself looking at photographs, mission reports, and personal accounts that painted a picture of operations unlike anything he had studied in military history courses. These photographs were taken in Cambodia in 1971, Eleanor explained as Rodriguez examined black and white images that showed figures in the same black uniforms he had seen on her identification. The official record shows no American military presence in that region during those dates. But we were there, conducting reconnaissance on North Vietnamese supply lines and coordinating with local resistance forces. The images were remarkable for their clarity and the level of detail they captured. Rodriguez could see faces, equipment, terrain features, and tactical positions that suggested careful documentation of highly professional military operations. What struck him most was the age of the personnel in the photographs. They appeared to be predominantly young women and men, none of whom looked like typical special forces operators. You were all so young, Rodriguez observed, looking up at Eleanor. The division recruited differently than other units, Eleanor explained. We weren't looking for the biggest or the strongest operators. We needed people who could blend in, who could think creatively under pressure, and who could maintain cover identities for extended periods. Many of us were linguists, cultural specialists, or had specific technical skills that traditional military training didn't provide. Rodriguez continued examining the documents, finding mission reports that detailed operations across Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and Central America. The scope was breathtaking: intelligence gathering, personnel extraction, technology transfer, and what appear to be early cyber warfare operations involving primitive computer systems. This mission here, Rodriguez pointed to a report dated 1974, shows your team preventing the assassination of a democratically elected leader in South America. According to this, the operation saved thousands of lives and prevented a regional war. Eleanor nodded solemnly. Operation Gentle Rain. We spent 8 months infiltrating the organization planning the assassination. I posed as a journalist covering regional politics while my team members took positions within the target security detail and the conspirators' inner circle. She paused, her fingers unconsciously moving to touch a small scar on her left temple. We nearly lost 2 team members during the extraction, and the mission was considered so sensitive that even the rescued leader was never told about our involvement. And none of this appears in any official record? None of it, Captain. As far as official history is concerned, that assassination plot was discovered by local intelligence services, and the conspirators were arrested in an unrelated investigation. Eleanor's voice carried a mixture of pride and frustration. We saved a democracy, prevented a war, and preserved American interests in the region, but we can't even tell our families what we accomplished. Rodriguez set down the photographs and looked at Eleanor with new understanding. How many operations like this were there? For the division as a whole, over 300 documented missions between 1967 and 1979. My personal involvement spanned 47 operations across 4 continents. Eleanor's response was delivered with the precision of someone who had memorized every detail of her service record. And, Captain, I was just one operative among dozens. The captain felt a growing sense of urgency about Eleanor's request. If her account was accurate, the Shadow Division represented a crucial but completely hidden chapter of American military history. More importantly, the veterans of these operations had been carrying the burden of their secrets for over 4 decades. Eleanor, you mentioned 11 surviving members of the division. Have any of the others attempted to get their records acknowledged? 3 have tried, Captain, but they ran into bureaucratic walls that seemed deliberately constructed to discourage further inquiry. Eleanor pulled another document from the envelope, a series of correspondence between former division members and various government agencies. Agent Carson, Thomas Carson, spent 2 years trying to get his medical records corrected to show injuries he received during a mission in East Berlin. The VA kept telling him there was no record of his deployment to Germany. Rodriguez examined the correspondence, noting the circular pattern of referrals and denials. What happened to Agent Carson? He died last year, Captain. Cancer, likely related to chemical exposure during one of our operations in Southeast Asia. He never received proper medical care because officially he was never exposed to anything more dangerous than office paperwork. Eleanor's voice tightened with barely controlled anger. His widow still doesn't know why he kept talking about missions that never happened during his final months. The weight of the situation was becoming clear to Rodriguez. This wasn't just about historical accuracy or military recognition. It was about veterans who had been denied basic services and benefits because their most significant service had been officially erased. What about the other attempts to get records acknowledged? Agent Williams tried to get her daughter's security clearance for a government position, but the background investigation kept hitting inconsistencies in Williams' service record. The investigators couldn't understand why there were gaps in her employment history during the years she was with the division. Eleanor shook her head. Williams had to watch her daughter get passed over for positions she was qualified for, all because of service she couldn't explain. Rodriguez was beginning to understand the personal cost of the division's secrecy. And the third attempt, Agent Kowalski tried to donate his division materials to the Military History Museum at West Point. He thought if he couldn't get official recognition, at least the historical record should be preserved. Eleanor's expression darkened. 2 weeks after he made contact with the museum, he received a visit from men identifying themselves as Defense Department officials. They confiscated his materials and reminded him of the non-disclosure agreements he had signed upon leaving the division. Confiscated his materials? Everything, Captain. Photographs, documents, personal journals from his missions. 40 years of carefully preserved history gone. And they made it clear that any further attempts to publicize division operations would result in serious legal consequences. Eleanor leaned forward in her chair. That's when those of us who were left realized we needed to approach this differently. We needed someone within the current military structure who could navigate the system properly. Rodriguez set down the correspondence and looked at Eleanor with growing respect and concern. And you think I'm that person? Captain, you have the security clearance to access classified historical records. You have the rank and position to initiate formal inquiries through proper channels. Most importantly, you have the integrity to pursue this even if it becomes complicated or controversial. Eleanor's voice carried the conviction of someone who had spent considerable time evaluating her options. We're not asking you to break any laws or reveal any secrets. We're asking you to help us follow the proper procedures for getting our service acknowledged now that the security justification for secrecy have largely passed. Rodriguez understood the magnitude of what Eleanor was proposing. If the Shadow Division had been as significant as she claimed, acknowledging its existence would require coordination between multiple government agencies and could potentially affect ongoing intelligence operations or diplomatic relationships. Eleanor assuming I agree to help, and I'm not saying I won't. What exactly would success look like to you and the other surviving members?" Eleanor smiled, and Rodriguez saw in her expression the same determination he had observed in his most committed officers. "Captain, we want 3 things. First, we want our service records corrected to reflect our actual military service, so that veterans' benefits and medical care are available based on our real exposure to hazards and combat situations. Second, we want our families to understand what we sacrificed during those 12 years. And third, we want to ensure that the historical record eventually includes the contributions of the Shadow Division to American national security." She paused, then added quietly, "We're not asking for parades or medals, Captain. We're just asking to be remembered as the veterans we are." Rodriguez looked at the documents spread across his desk, then at Eleanor's weathered hands, and finally at the mysterious jacket that had concealed so many secrets for so many years. "Eleanor, I think the first step is for me to verify what you've told me through official channels. If the Shadow Division existed, there should be some trace of it in classified historical records, even if those records are heavily compartmentalized." Eleanor nodded. "We were hoping you would say that, Captain, because there's something else we need to show you. Something that proves the division's existence in a way that can't be dismissed or explained away." Eleanor reached for her jacket and began working at another concealed seam, this one located near the collar. Rodriguez watched in amazement as she revealed a second hidden compartment, one that appeared to have been sealed with military-grade waterproofing. From within this compartment, she withdrew an item that made Rodriguez immediately understand why the Shadow Division had remained secret for so long. It was a small electronic device, no larger than a deck of cards, but clearly sophisticated far beyond anything Rodriguez had seen in conventional military equipment. The device had a small screen, several buttons, and what appeared to be antenna ports. Despite its age, it looked remarkably well-preserved. "Captain, what you're looking at is a prototype communication device developed specifically for Shadow Division operations," Eleanor explained, handling the device with obvious familiarity. "This particular unit was my primary communication link during deep cover operations between 1973 and 1976. Rodriguez leaned forward to examine the device more closely. The technology appeared to be decades ahead of what he knew had been available to military units during the 1970s. "This looks like something from the 1990s at the earliest. How could this have existed in the 70s? The division had access to experimental technology that was sometimes 20 years ahead of what was available to conventional forces," Eleanor replied. "We were essentially a testing ground for equipment and techniques that were too sensitive or too advanced for broader military deployment." She pressed a sequence of buttons on the device, and the small screen flickered to life, displaying what appeared to be encrypted text. "It still works. Limited functionality, but yes. The encryption protocols are still active, and it can still access certain archived communication logs." Eleanor manipulated the device with practiced ease, scrolling through what appeared to be mission reports and operational updates. "Captain, what you're seeing here are real-time communication from operations that officially never happened." Rodriguez read the text appearing on the small screen, his disbelief growing with each line. The communications detailed coordination between division operatives and high-level government officials, including individuals he recognized as former presidents and cabinet members. The level of detail and the obvious authenticity of the communications made it impossible to dismiss Eleanor's claims. "This communication here," Rodriguez pointed to a message dated December 1975, "shows direct authorization from the White House for an operation in Angola. But, according to official records, the U.S. had no involvement in Angola during that period." "Operation Silent Thunder," Eleanor confirmed. "We spent 3 months training and coordinating with local forces opposed to the Soviet-backed government. The operation was successful in preventing Soviet expansion in the region, but it was so sensitive that even most of the participants never knew they were working with American operatives." Rodriguez continued reading, finding communications that revealed division involvement in operations across the globe. The scope was staggering, from preventing nuclear technology transfers in Eastern Europe to coordinating rescue operations for American personnel in hostile territories. Each operation appeared to have been conducted with complete secrecy and official deniability. Eleanor, this device represents evidence that could rewrite the history of American foreign policy during the Cold War. The implications are enormous, which is exactly why we've been so careful about revealing it. Captain, Eleanor replied, powering down the device. We understand the sensitivity of what we're asking, but we also understand that this evidence proves our service in a way that can't be disputed or ignored. Rodriguez sat back in his chair, trying to process the full magnitude of what Eleanor had revealed. The Shadow Division hadn't just been a secret military unit. It had been a crucial component of American strategy during one of the most critical periods in modern history. How many of these devices exist? As far as we know, 11, one for each surviving member of the division. They were designed to be our proof of service, our insurance policy in case the promises of eventual recognition were never fulfilled. Eleanor carefully returned the device to its hidden compartment. We were told that when the time was right, these devices would serve as our credentials for accessing our true service records. And you believe the time is right now? Eleanor nodded firmly. Captain, the Cold War ended over 30 years ago. Most of the operations we conducted are no longer sensitive from a national security perspective. The governments we worked with or against have changed. The technologies we protected are now outdated, and the strategic situations that required our secrecy have been resolved. Rodriguez understood the logic, but he also recognized the challenges. Eleanor, even if the security justifications have expired, acknowledging the division's existence could still have political and diplomatic implications. Some of these operations involved actions in countries where we officially maintained friendly relations. We've considered that, Captain, Eleanor replied. We're not asking for immediate public disclosure of operational details. We're asking for internal military recognition that would allow us to access appropriate veteran services and, eventually, when the time is truly right, contribute to the historical record. The captain looked at the evidence spread across his desk, documents, photographs, communications, and technological proof that painted a picture of military service unlike anything in official records. Eleanor's request was reasonable, but the process of verifying and acknowledging her claims would likely require coordination at the highest levels of government. Eleanor, I need to ask you something directly. Are you and the other surviving members prepared for the possibility that this process could take years? That it might involve extensive investigation and verification procedures? Captain, we've been waiting over 40 years already. We're prepared to be patient, as long as we know the process is moving forward. Eleanor's voice carried the weariness of someone who had carried secrets for far too long. But we're also aware that we're not getting any younger. Agent Morrison died 3 months ago from complications related to injuries she received during a mission in 1978. Agent Foster has been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, and his memories of division operations are beginning to fade. The urgency of the situation was becoming clear to Rodriguez. The surviving members of the Shadow Division weren't just seeking recognition. They were racing against time to preserve their history before it was lost forever. What would you need from me to begin the formal process? Eleanor smiled with obvious relief. We need you to initiate an official inquiry through proper military channels. Use your clearance and position to access classified historical records related to special operations during the 1960s and 1970s. Look for any references to unconventional units or operations that don't align with official records. She paused, then continued. We also need you to establish contact with current intelligence officials who might have inherited oversight responsibility for division records. There may be protocols already in place for situations like this, procedures that we as civilians simply don't have access to. Rodriguez nodded, understanding the approach Eleanor was proposing. And if I find verification of the division's existence through official channels, then what? Then we work together to develop a plan for appropriate recognition and record correction, Eleanor replied. We provide full cooperation with any verification procedures, and we work within whatever security constraints are deemed necessary to protect ongoing interests. The captain looked at Eleanor's weathered hands, still resting on the arms of her chair, and thought about the 40 years of secrets those hands had carried. Eleanor, I want you to know that regardless of what I find through official channels, I believe your account. The evidence you've provided, the level of detail, the consistency of your story, it all points to genuine service that deserves recognition. Eleanor's eyes brightened with tears she didn't allow to fall. Thank you, Captain. That means more than you can know. Rodriguez stood up from his desk and walked to the window overlooking the naval base. Young sailors were going about their daily duties, unaware that they were witnessing a conversation that could reshape their understanding of military history. Eleanor, I'm going to help you and the other surviving members of the Shadow Division. But I need you to understand that once I start this process, there may be no going back. Are you and the others prepared for whatever consequences might arise from revealing these secrets? Eleanor stood as well, her posture straightening with obvious determination. Captain, we spent 40 years living with the consequences of keeping these secrets. We're ready to face whatever comes from finally telling the truth 3 months after Eleanor Hartwell's visit. Captain Rodriguez stood in a secure conference room in the Pentagon, surrounded by officials whose security clearances exceeded his own. The investigation he had initiated had uncovered evidence that validated every aspect of Eleanor's account and revealed the Shadow Division to be even more significant than she had described. The conference table was covered with declassified documents, photographs, and communication logs that painted a comprehensive picture of 12 years of operations that had shaped the outcome of the Cold War. Representatives from the CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and National Security Council sat alongside military historians and archivists who had spent weeks verifying the authenticity of materials provided by surviving division members. Captain Rodriguez, said Director Sarah Chun from the CIA's Historical Review Panel, your investigation has uncovered one of the most successful classified operations programs in American history. The Shadow Division's contributions to national security during the Cold War period were extraordinary. Rodriguez nodded, thinking of Eleanor and the 10 other surviving members who were waiting to learn the results of the formal review process. Director Chun, what's the timeline for official recognition of their service? The President has personally reviewed the findings and authorized immediate correction of all service records for Shadow Division personnel, replied General Patricia Williams from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Additionally, all surviving members will receive appropriate military honors and access to full veterans benefits retroactive to their original service dates. The news was better than Rodriguez had dared to hope. Over the past 3 months, he had developed a deep respect for Eleanor and her fellow veterans, and he knew how much official recognition would mean to them. What about the historical record? Rodriguez asked. Will the division's contributions eventually be acknowledged publicly? Director Chun exchanged glances with her colleagues before responding. The National Security Council has approved a phased declassification program. Beginning next year, selected Shadow Division operations will be gradually released to military historians and, eventually, to the public. The full scope of their service will be revealed over a 10-year period as ongoing security reviews are completed. Rodriguez felt a surge of satisfaction. Eleanor's courage in revealing her secret service had not only achieved recognition for herself and her colleagues, but would eventually contribute to a more complete understanding of American history during the Cold War era. There's something else, Captain, added Colonel Marcus Thompson from Military Personnel Records. The surviving division members have requested to meet with you before the official recognition ceremony. They wanted to thank you personally for your role in making this possible. 2 weeks later, Rodriguez found himself in a conference room at a military facility in Virginia, facing 11 elderly individuals who represented one of the most remarkable military units in American history. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, still wearing her mysterious jacket, but now Rodriguez understood that every patch, every thread, every carefully concealed compartment represented years of service that had finally been acknowledged. "Captain Rodriguez," Eleanor began, her voice stronger and more confident than it had been during their first meeting. "On behalf of all surviving members of the Shadow Division, we want to express our gratitude for your willingness to pursue the truth, regardless of the complications it might have created for your career." The other veterans nodded in agreement. Rodriguez saw in their faces the same mixture of relief and vindication that Eleanor had expressed. These were people who had carried extraordinary burdens for over 4 decades, and finally, those burdens were being lifted. "The honor has been mine," Rodriguez replied. "Your service helped secure the freedoms that we all enjoy today. The least we could do was ensure that service was properly recognized." Agent Thomas Foster, whose Alzheimer's diagnosis had been mentioned during Rodriguez's first meeting with Eleanor, stood slowly from his chair. "Captain, we want you to have something." He reached into a briefcase and withdrew a leather-bound volume that appeared to be hand-assembled. "This is a complete operational history of the Shadow Division, compiled from materials maintained by all surviving members," Foster explained. "It includes mission reports, photographs, personal accounts, and technical specifications for equipment used during our operations. We prepared it as a gift to the Military Historical Archives." Rodriguez accepted the volume with appropriate solemnity, understanding that he was holding the authoritative record of operations that had influenced the course of world history. "This will be invaluable to historians and researchers studying the Cold War period." "Captain," said Agent Maria Santos, who had coordinated intelligence operations in Central America, "we also want you to know that your investigation has had effects beyond our personal recognition. The Defense Department has established new protocols for acknowledging classified service when security justifications have expired. Future veterans won't have to wait 40 years for their contributions to be recognized." This news pleased Rodriguez even more than the acknowledgement of the Shadow Division service. The systematic changes resulting from his investigation would benefit countless future veterans whose service might otherwise be forgotten or obscured. Eleanor stood and walked to Rodriguez, extending her weathered hand in a firm handshake. "Captain, there's one more thing. The jacket." Rodriguez looked puzzled as Eleanor began removing the garment that had concealed so many secrets for so many years. "This jacket has served its purpose," Eleanor continued. "It protected our evidence, preserved our history, and helped us maintain our connection to service that we couldn't officially claim. But now that our service has been acknowledged, we wanted to serve a different purpose." She held out the jacket to Rodriguez. "We want you to have it, as a reminder that service takes many forms, and that sometimes the most important contributions to national security are the ones that can't be immediately recognized or celebrated." Rodriguez accepted the jacket with deep emotion. Up close, he could see the extraordinary craftsmanship that had gone into creating and maintaining the hidden compartments and concealed elements that had preserved the division's history. It was a masterpiece of practical engineering and determined preservation. "I'm honored, Eleanor. I'll make sure it's properly preserved and eventually displayed with appropriate recognition of what it represents." "Actually, Captain," Eleanor smiled, "we had something else in mind. We want you to wear it, as a reminder that you never know when you might meet a veteran whose service isn't reflected in official records, whose contributions aren't acknowledged in history books, but whose sacrifices helped secure the nation we all serve." Rodriguez looked around the table at the 11 surviving members of the Shadow Division, 11 individuals who had carried extraordinary secrets for over 40 years and had finally found someone willing to help them share the truth. He thought about Eleanor's original visit to his office, when he had dismissed her jacket as old and worn, never imagining that it concealed evidence of some of the most important military operations of the 20th century. "I'll wear it with pride," Rodriguez promised, understanding that he was accepting not just a piece of clothing, but a responsibility to remember that service takes many forms and that every veteran's story deserves to be told. 6 months later, at the official recognition ceremony for the Shadow Division held in the East Room of the White House, Captain Rodriguez stood beside Eleanor and her fellow veterans as the president presented them with the Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Eleanor wore a new dress uniform, carefully recreated from division specifications and bearing the insignia that had been hidden for so many years. As the ceremony concluded and the veterans were surrounded by family members who were finally learning the truth about their loved ones' mysterious absences during the Cold War, Rodriguez stepped outside onto the White House lawn. He was wearing Eleanor's jacket over his dress uniform, an unusual combination that drew curious glances from other attendees. A young Navy lieutenant approached him with obvious puzzlement. "Excuse me, Captain, but that's an unusual jacket. It looks like it's been through several wars." Rodriguez smiled, thinking of Eleanor's courage in revealing her secrets and the 11 remarkable individuals who had finally received the recognition they deserved. "Lieutenant, you'd be amazed by the stories that old jackets can tell. Sometimes the most important history is hidden in the most unexpected places." As the sun set over the nation's capital, Rodriguez reflected on the lesson Eleanor had taught him, that service takes many forms, that sacrifice is often invisible, and that sometimes the most important thing a military officer can do is listen carefully to the stories that veterans carry, especially when those stories seem impossible to believe. The jacket now hung in his office, a reminder that behind every unusual story, every unexpected encounter, every seemingly impossible claim, there might be a truth that deserves to be heard, verified, and ultimately honored. The morning fog rolled across the naval base as Captain Marcus Rodriguez stepped out his office, adjusting his crisp uniform. 23 years of service had taught him to spot irregularities from a mile away, and today something caught his eye immediately. Standing near the commissary entrance was a woman in her 70s, wearing what appeared to be a faded military jacket that looked like it had survived several wars. Rodriguez chuckled to himself as he approached the woman. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and, despite her age, she carried herself with remarkable posture. The jacket, however, was a different story entirely. The fabric was worn thin in places. The color had faded from what might once have been olive green to something resembling muddy brown, and there were patches sewn on with thread that didn't quite match. "Ma'am, that jacket's older than dirt," Rodriguez said with a friendly laugh as he drew closer. He meant no disrespect. It was simply his way of breaking the ice with civilians who visited the base. The woman turned to face him, and he noticed her eyes held an intensity that seemed oddly familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. The woman smiled politely but said nothing about the jacket comment. Instead, she extended a weathered hand. "Captain Rodriguez, I presume? I'm Eleanor Hartwell. I have an appointment with you this morning." Her voice carried a slight rasp that spoke of years and experience, but there was something else there too, an authority that made Rodriguez unconsciously straighten his posture. As they walked toward his office, Rodriguez found himself stealing glances at the mysterious jacket. Up close, he could see that what he had initially dismissed as random patches were actually carefully placed elements. Some appeared to be covering areas where insignia might have once been attached. Others looked like they were hiding damage, perhaps burns or tears that told stories he couldn't begin to imagine. "I hope you don't mind me saying, Mrs. Hartwell, but that jacket has certainly seen better days," Rodriguez commented as he held open the door to the administrative building. "Looks like it might be a family heirloom or something from a military surplus store." Eleanor paused at the threshold, her hand briefly touching one of the faded patches on the jacket's chest. "Something like that, Captain," she replied quietly, "though I think you might be surprised by its actual history." The corridors of the administrative building echoed with their footsteps as Rodriguez led her toward his office. Other personnel they passed gave respectful nods to the captain, but he noticed several double takes when they saw Eleanor's jacket. Some of the older non-commissioned officers seemed to linger, their eyes following the pair with expressions Rodriguez couldn't quite interpret. "Coffee, Mrs. Hartwell," Rodriguez offered as they entered his office. The space was typical military efficiency: clean desk, filing cabinets, American flag in the corner, and walls decorated with commendations and photographs from various deployments and ceremonies. "That would be lovely. Thank you." Eleanor settled into the chair across from his desk, but she didn't remove the jacket despite the warmth of the office. Rodriguez noticed she kept her hands resting on the armrests, but her fingers occasionally moved to touch different parts of the jacket's fabric, almost as if she were reading Braille. As Rodriguez prepared the coffee, he tried to recall why he had agreed to this meeting. His assistant had scheduled it, mentioning something about a historical research project related to military personnel records. It wasn't unusual for family members to seek information about relatives who had served, especially older relatives trying to piece together family military history. "So, Mrs. Hartwell," Rodriguez began, settling behind his desk with 2 steaming mugs, "my assistant mentioned you're researching military records? Looking into a family member's service, perhaps?" Eleanor accepted the coffee with both hands, and Rodriguez noticed several small scars across her knuckles and fingers, the kind that suggested someone who had worked with their hands, possibly in demanding or dangerous conditions. "In a manner of speaking, yes," she replied, "though the records I'm interested in might be somewhat complicated to access." "Complicated how?" Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, his curiosity growing. Most requests for military records were straightforward, if sometimes bureaucratically challenging. "Well, Captain, some of the service I'm researching was conducted under circumstances that required a certain level of discretion." Eleanor's eyes met his directly, and Rodriguez felt that familiar sensation again, the feeling that he should recognize something about this woman. "Classified operations?" Rodriguez set down his coffee mug, his demeanor shifting slightly toward the more formal. "If this involved classified materials, there would be protocols to follow and clearances to verify." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Among other things, yes. Operations that officially never happened. Personnel who, according to most records, were never there." She paused, taking a sip of her coffee. "I'm hoping you might help me understand what procedures exist for acknowledging service that was deliberately obscured." Rodriguez felt the first stirring of something beyond mere curiosity. During his years in the Navy, he had heard whispers of operations and personnel whose existence was compartmentalized to such a degree that even knowing about them required special clearance. He had always assumed such things were the stuff of movies and novels, but the way Eleanor spoke suggested otherwise. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have to ask, what's your connection to this research? Are you representing a family member or working with a historical organization?" Rodriguez kept his voice professional, but he was beginning to sense that this conversation might venture into territory he wasn't prepared for. Eleanor set down her coffee and looked directly at him. Her weathered hands moved to the front of the jacket, and Rodriguez watched as she began to carefully work at what he had assumed was just another patch. As her fingers manipulated the fabric, he realized it wasn't actually a patch at all. It was a cleverly concealed flap that had been sewn to blend seamlessly with the jacket's worn appearance. "Captain Rodriguez," Eleanor said quietly, her voice taking on a tone that made him unconsciously lean forward. "Before I answer that question, I think you should see what this old jacket has been hiding all these years."